We are very pleased. Ooh, recording in progress. Excellent. Good morning and welcome to Reconstructing Judaism from Different Perspectives. I'm very pleased to introduce our three panelists. We have HBT's Director of Education, Hillary Engler. We have Congregation Dorshate Tzedek's Rabbi Toba Spitzer, also a Reconstructing congregation, and we have Craig Schneider, a congregant here at HBT. And they will be offering different perspectives based on their roles in their respective congregations and in their personal lives about how Reconstructing Judaism has been a part of Jewish life for them. And so I would like to first open this conversation with you all by asking Rabbi Toba if you would give us a brief history of Reconstructing Judaism and where did it come from and what are some of the major tenets?
Cool. Great. Hi, everybody in the room. Hi, folks on Zoom. So I just want to say a little bit about the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. So Reconstructing Judaism is our movement. Reconstructionist Judaism is sort of the stream of Judaism. So in 1885, Mordecai Kaplan, who was 4 years old then and known as Muttel, lived in a completely traditional Jewish
I don't think you're
culture.
going to be warm enough, Sienna. It's very, very cold out.
The Zoom voice. So again, Mordecai Kaplan, then known as Muttel, he was 4 years old in 1885. He lived in a fully traditional Jewish culture in Lithuania. His father was a learned rabbi, and the family intention was that little Muttel, little Mordecai, would also become a rabbi. So flash forward 60 years later, 1945, Muttel is now Mordecai. He moved to America when he was 8 in 1889. He did become a rabbi. He was actually ordained. He went back, he studied in America, but went back to Europe to get his ordination. But he's not, in 1945, he's no longer situated so comfortably in the Jewish world. Actually, he had published a prayer book, and in 1945, the Union of Orthodox Rabbis denounced and banned Kaplan because of the Sabbath prayer book that his Reconstructionist Foundation had just published. And there were reports that a group of rabbis had actually burned the prayer book in a cherem ceremony. So the question is, what happened? What happened between 1885 and 1945? And I think what happened is a good sort of explanation of where Reconstructionist Judaism come from. So Kaplan comes to America and is very much a product of both American and Jewish civilizations at the time. He studied for the rabbinate at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was the birthplace of conservative Judaism, while he was at the same time pursuing studies at Columbia University in philosophy, sociology, and anthropology. He, like I said, he got smicha, he got ordination back in Europe as an Orthodox rabbi, and he graduated from JTS early in the 1900s and started serving an Orthodox congregation, and at some point was like, I don't believe what I'm saying. Like, I don't believe the Torah was given by God. I don't believe the Israelites actually crossed through the sea. Like, I just can't do this anymore. So in 1922, he left that congregation and he founded the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. And the block, I think it's 85th Street, on the Upper West Side of New York, there's a block that's named for Mordecai Kaplan, and it has both synagogues on it. It's got the Orthodox Center that he founded, and then like down the street, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism. So literally in that block, you can like see his movement. So 1922, SAJ, the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, is founded, and he taught rabbis and Jewish educators at the Jewish Theological Seminary from the 1920s through his retirement in 1963. So I think, and what Kaplan did in that time was really reframe how we think about what Judaism is. So this is very simplistic, but if you think about the three sort of poles of Jewish life, God, Torah, and Israel, meaning the Jewish people, at the time, in the early 1900s, the Reform movement was in the God category, meaning for a Reform Jew in the early 1900s, what it meant to be a Jew was to believe in ethical monotheism, to have a certain view, but at that time, the practices of Judaism were not that important, or they were actively removing them. So this is the period when the Reform movement was trying to move the Sabbath to Sunday, trying to get confirmation not to be in addition to bar mitzvah, but instead of bar mitzvah, following Protestant tradition. There are many Reform shuls at that time. You were not allowed to wear a kippah or a talit. So the idea was Jews should look like everybody else in America or originally in Germany, but our beliefs is what set us apart from Christianity. So they were in the God column. While Orthodox Judaism, conservative Judaism didn't exist yet, Orthodox Judaism was firmly in the Torah category, meaning what it meant to be a Jew was less about what you believed, but that you were a Torah Jew, meaning you kept Shabbat and you kept kosher and you followed the laws of the Torah as the rabbis understood them. So Judaism was either a belief system or a system of practice or both. But Kaplan said no. Where we should be focusing is on the Israel part, on the Jewish people part, because he said what Judaism actually is whatever Jewish people are doing. And the Judaism of the Bible is not the same as the Judaism of the early rabbinic period, is not the Judaism of Yemen or of Babylonia, in the 900s, it is not the Judaism of America in the 20th century. So he coined a phrase, Judaism as a civilization, and because everyone who is interested in Reconstructionism should be subjected to a little bit of Kaplan, I'm going to read you. I think the reason we haven't conquered the world is because Kaplan is almost impossibly dense. But I will, in the sense of not stupid, but in the sense of hard to read. But anyway, I just want to give you a little. So his magnum opus was Judaism as a Civilization, written in the 1920s, published in the 1930s. So this is what he said. And he wrote this book because he was seeing a crisis, because Judaism is always in crisis, which is a lot of, especially Eastern European Jews coming over to America and within a generation losing most of their religious practice. They had to work on Saturdays, they had to keep their stores open on Shabbat, and they were fleeing, and they weren't so much just fleeing Russia, they were also fleeing the shtetl and reveling in the freedom of America. So he was facing that challenge and saying, how do we meet that challenge? So this is what he wrote. The Jews' religion is but one element in their life that is challenged by the present environment. It is a mistake, therefore, to conceive the task of conserving Jewish life as essentially a task of saving the Jews' religion. I love this next metaphor. When a person is about to abandon a house for fear that it might fall about his ears at any moment, it is folly to try to convince him that he ought to remain in it because of the beautiful frescoes on its walls. Jewish life is becoming uninhabitable because it is in danger of collapse. The problem is how to make it habitable. To drop the metaphor and return to the more abstract method of viewing the problem of Judaism, the task before the Jew is to save the otherness of Jewish life. Put more specifically, this means that apart from the life which, as a citizen, the Jew shares with the non-Jews, their life should consist of certain social relationships to maintain, cultural interests to foster, activities to engage in, organizations to belong to, amenities to conform to, moral and social standards to live up to as a Jew. All this constitutes the element of otherness. Judaism as otherness is thus something far more comprehensive than Jewish religion. It includes that nexus of a history, literature, language, social organization, folk sanctions, standards of conduct, social and spiritual ideals, and aesthetic values, which in their totality form a civilization. So this was sort of Kaplan's insight that Judaism is a civilization, and moreover, he said it's an evolving religious civilization. It's evolving, meaning it's, again, very different in historical periods, and it's sort of false to look back and pretend that the Judaism of our ancestors is the same as our Judaism today. It's religious. He flirted for a while with ethical humanism, but came back and said we need some kind of God concept, some kind of sense of sanctity and divinity at the core. And it's a civilization. So it encompasses the arts and our communal life and our ethical standards and all these things, not just, Shabbat morning. And actually, he wrote in the 1920s, if Jewish life remains centered in the sanctuary on Shabbat morning, it will die, which is, I think, a really interesting insight and something we're still struggling with. And then where did Reconstruction come in? He writes a little later in the book, the Jew will have to save Judaism before Judaism will be in a position to save the Jew. We must rediscover, reinterpret, and reconstruct the civilization of our people. So he really wanted Judaism to be a positive project of the Jewish people. He saw it as in crisis in the modern world, but also great opportunity. He loved America. He was born in Lithuania and asked to be buried in Israel, but he loved America, and he also thought America had to fully embrace what he saw as the best aspects of American civilization: democracy, pluralism, and egalitarianism. So for him, it was a project of taking the best of American culture, integrating it into Jewish culture, and then inviting Jews into this project of Reconstruction. And he had no interest, I'll just finish with this, he had no interest in starting a new movement. He just thought everybody would agree with him and that would become American Judaism. It's not what happened. His son-in-law, Ira Eisenstein, said, look, father-in-law, if you want there to be this vision of Judaism, we need our own rabbinical school. And Kaplan said, only after I retire. Kaplan taught until he was 83. He died at the age of 101. So the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was not founded until 1968 when he retired from JTS, because he did not want to be in competition with JTS. However, the movement started. So the arms of the movement sort of started as a series of organizations. So the Jewish Reconstructionist Foundation was established in 1940. That was mostly to publish Kaplan and his followers. The Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations in Chavurot was founded in the 1950s. Many of those were conservative congregations with rabbis who'd been trained by Kaplan at JTS, or they were Chavurot. They were groups they didn't get together to pray. They got together to study Kaplan and other things. RRC, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, was founded by his son-in-law in 1968. And then the Federation of Reconstructionist Congregations of Chavurot became the Jewish Reconstructionist Federation in the 1980s, and then that became Reconstructing Judaism about a decade ago. So it became a movement officially when the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College was set up. And today, the congregational arm and the college are merged in Reconstructing Judaism, and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, of which I'm a member and former president, is a separate arm that's related but functions separately. So that's just some background, I think, to give us where we are today.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Tova. So I would like to, now that we have some context and some history, to ask each of you with a maximum of 5 minutes to just share your personal journey of Reconstructionism, of reconstructing Judaism, either as the movement or as the concept and the system of Reconstructionism.
You want me to go first?
Whoever would like, go for it. Go for it.
Okay. So I actually grew up in a Reconstructionist congregation, but a big asterisk to that, because it did not affiliate until I was like a junior or senior in high school. So I say I come from a large, well-known today Reconstructionist Jewish congregation, Oseh Shalom in Laurel, Maryland, but it's not like I grew up with Reconstructionist theology. It's just kind of that background. But I remember probably when I was in college talking to my mother, who was president of the synagogue in that era, about like, okay, well, what is Reconstructionist theology? And, after we talked about it, I kind of landed in, oh, okay, so there's this continuum. It's Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, and Orthodox. And she said, that's a way oversimplification. But that framework still works for me, because I kind of feel like Reform is too Reform and Conservative is too Conservative. But what does that mean? And one concrete example I give, because our kids went to a conservative day school, so spent a lot of time with, the capital C conservative Jewish theology, and both we and our kids wrestled with it kind of throughout that period, because we come from a different perspective. So here's one concrete example I give of how a Reconstructionist person, like someone who embraces that approach, might approach an issue different than someone raised in or believing in a conservative approach to a problem. So this example will kind of date when this conversation was happening. It was when Massachusetts was deciding whether or not to permit gay marriage. And everyone at the table, we were the only, everyone else was a quote conservative Jew. We were the two Reconstructionists at this dinner party, and all of us believed in it. There was no like ideological opposition. It was purely theological. And for my wife and I, it's consistent with our values. So therefore we support gay marriage. People who love each other should be able to get married regardless. But the conservative Jews had to go to the halakha and find a way to justify that political belief. And it was just a different way of approaching it, right? We start with the values and they would start with the halakha, and hopefully you can get where you want to get. One other, and I'll just say personally, if we think about some of the basic tenets of Reconstructionism, because the history was wonderful, but we didn't get to say what kind of makes it different besides you have to accept Torah from Mount Sinai, is, feminism, right? One of the great trivia questions: who was the first person bat mitzvah? Rabbi Kaplan's daughter. So feminism was always part of Reconstructionism. Values-based decision-making, I'm sure we're going to get into that. And that might be, for the people in the congregation, that might be their most prominent, like, oh, this is different. That the fact that, I'm sure we'll talk about it during this conversation. And what I would say is, if one is a scientist, Reconstructionism is a type of Judaism that is easier to engage with. That I would argue that we take an intellectual approach to the text. And I think I have one more point. Oh, and I'll just say, in terms of the personal journey, the one issue I struggled the most with, one of the basic principles of Reconstructionism, was chosenness. The hardest thing for me to give up on was chosenness. And it's not because I think the Jews are special per se, or that I literally think God, raised his hand down and said, Jews, you are special, but that we as a people have suffered so much for thousands of years that if we're not chosen, what was the point? That was my struggle, but I ultimately came around to it. And, if there's questions during the Q&A, happy to talk about that.
Yeah, so let me add a little bit about what makes us Reconstructionists. Thank you, because I was hard to cram the history and that in, and it'll connect to my own connection. Yeah, so when it's sort of interesting, people always say, is Reconstructionist more or less? I'm like, more or less what? And it's like, they have that thing. I do let people know we grew out of the left wing of the conservative movement. I think people do tend to, but there are similarities. I think instead of putting us on a continuum, which is not really a continuum mostly because both conservative and Reform Judaism have become much more Reconstructionist, in the last 25 years. I think there's elements of each that we have. So we grew out of the left wing of the conservative movement, and where Kaplan really broke with conservative Judaism was his famous phrase. He says, the past has a vote, but not a veto, meaning we are grounded in tradition. We don't just willy-nilly leave tradition, but other things might trump it. For example, he was like, women, he saw egalitarianism as this principle in American life, and women actually didn't even have the vote yet, but we're moving towards equality with men in the legal sphere. He said, we should just adopt that in Judaism. We don't need to go through a whole halakhic process. And he actually called ritual mitzvot folkways, which was very radical for the time. He said, these are folkways. He said, these aren't law, because there's nobody to enforce it as law. Although he did believe in ethical obligation. So I think for me personally, as someone who did not grow up observant, thinking about Judaism as spiritual practice rather than law was quite, inviting. He had, and his Kaplan's process was to what he called transvaluation. He said, what did something used to mean? Is it still functioning that way? If it's not, we need to reconstruct it. So, we're not going to get rid of Shabbat. like the Reform movement was trying to do at the time. We're also not just going to say this is the law and we follow it like conservative and Orthodox Jews were doing, rather to say what's the point of Shabbat, and if the practices aren't fulfilling that original point anymore, let's change the practices. He also believed there were things that were not reconstructible, and chosenness was one of them. There were a few things so women being segregated was not reconstructible, and the chosenness of Jews, and we can talk about that. He's a brilliant demolition of liberal Jewish arguments for holding on to chosenness. So he took it out of his prayer book, and that's the reason that they wanted to burn it, actually, was he took chosenness out. When I had never heard of Reconstructionism growing up. I grew up in a chavurah, the Farbrengen chavurah in DC, and I stopped saying the first paragraph of the Aleinu because I spoke Hebrew, and I was like, I'm not going to say who didn't make me like other people. That's disgusting, you know. So I just stopped saying it, and then I'd pick up later. And then when I went to my interview at RRC, when I was like learning about Reconstructionism, I was like, they have different words. This is so cool. This is great. So what we share with Reform Judaism, I think, is Reform Judaism's focus on the ethical and social justice. Like that's definitely been it was important for Kaplan, and our movement has really been at the forefront, I think, of those kinds of changes. What we share with conservative Judaism, it was a continued emphasis on Jewish practice and not jettisoning that. And what we share with the Orthodox world is community and the incredible emphasis on community. And, you know, I have some orthoprax teachers, and they're very comfortable, I think, at Dorsey Tzedek, even though they know most of our members are not observant, because it feels Orthodox in that sense, that we put a very high priority on community. And that's because Kaplan deeply believed that through belonging to community, we then take on beliefs and practices. And that was his sense of peoplehood. And I grew up in Habonim, the labor Zionist youth movement. So I already had a sense of Judaism, not as a religion, but as a collective, you know, sort of endeavor of the Jewish people. And so when I found out about Reconstructionism, it's like, I didn't believe in chosenness. I believed in the Jewish, you know, Jewish peoplehood. And it gave me a way in as a non-observant Jew to explore Jewish practice. And finally, God. Kaplan saw the God issue as a big one for why people were not coming to shul, and so he really wanted to transvalue the idea of God. And he talked about God as process, God as a power. He did this very early in the 1920s and 30s. Another reason that people found him somewhat heretical, but really believe he had this great quote that like Jews were like leaving their brains at the door when they came into synagogue. And he really, like you were saying, wasn't so much to be intellectual, but like it should be consistent. He also was a little intolerant of mythical language. He actually took Mi Kamocha out of the prayer book, the Song of the Sea, because he thought it meant you had to have a literal belief in the crossing of the sea rather than appreciating the mythology of it. He took out part of the Amidah where it says that, you know, Moses received Torah at Sinai. Like he was a very hyper rationalist in this sort of 1920s way. We've put those things back in the prayer book, some of them back. Chosenness remains out, with an appreciation that it can be poetry and we can appreciate it. There can be metaphor and we can appreciate it. But he really did want there to be a sort of ideological consistency. And the final story I'll tell about Kaplan is my teacher told me he taught Midrash at the Jewish Theological Seminary because Midrash is quite radical, and he would not let students take notes because he didn't want the hires up to know what he was teaching them. Yeah, so he was teaching like rabbinic commentary on Torah, which can be quite radical. And the way he was teaching it, he didn't want anyone to know what he was teaching. So I find that, so he saw himself in a continuum in Judaism, but others experienced him as quite dramatic. So I can talk more with questions about sort of some of the practical implications. But again, I think sort of opening up our concepts of God, a non-halakhic approach, a non-legal way approach to Jewish practice, a commitment to social justice, and an emphasis on community. I would put those as sort of core elements of different, every Reconstructionist congregation is different, but I think you'll find some version of that in all of them.
All right, so I've got a little bit of a more personal take. So I grew up outside of Richmond, Virginia, also not in an observant household. We belonged to a conservative leaning shul when I was little, and I remember it being really warm. And then when I was older, we joined this giant impersonal Reform synagogue where people wore fancy clothes, and it was very much about appearances, and I would sit and read in the margins in the prayer book. And that's where I had my bat mitzvah, and I just memorized everything. And I did confirmation in 10th grade. And I helped out in the Sunday school because I liked kids. And then through a neighbor who was more traditional, I participated in a Jewish ethics discussion group that was led by the local Orthodox rabbi with some more observant kids. And I felt like that had some depth, which really attracted me to it. And then after I went to college, my family switched synagogues again. And they joined a conservative shul, and that's where my younger brother had his bar mitzvah. And then they switched again, and now I think they're back at the conservadox. And then when I was in college, I spent way more time with sports than either Judaism or academics, honestly. But then towards the end of my undergrad, I realized that Judaism had a path for my interest in kind of learning and thinking about things that really mattered and leading a good life. And I was a really angsty late adolescent. I was coming out. I was struggling with myself and my family of origin, which is really conservative. And I liked philosophy and literature, but I was kind of jaded by experiences I'd had with people who were really smart and really well educated, but not good, kind people. So I was like, what's the point? And then I had some transformative experiences with Jewish professors who were really deeply admirable people. And I thought, well, if I could be like those people, then I would be on an okay life path. So at the end of college, I actually applied to HUC, the Reform Rabbinical School, because Reform was what we'd belong to the most. And I knew that I could be gay and be Reform. And I got this conditional acceptance where I was supposed to spend a year really steeped in Reform Judaism, because they were like, well, you haven't really been so practicing. And I was like, well, that's true. So I went to Reform Day School. And when I went there, I was really moved by the teachers. And I thought, well, I could do that. And then HUC wanted me to sign something saying that I wouldn't marry a non-Jew. And I was already with Emily. So that was out. And so I decided to get my master's in Jewish education because teaching was a job that seemed kind of like doable and respectable, and I needed to be employed. And then, so for a while, people had been telling me to check out Reconstructionism. They said, oh, I really think this would be a good fit for you. And I thought, like, aren't they like a weird fringe group? I don't know. But then I was in Philly, where Reconstructionism has a big presence, because that's where RRC is. And the more I read about it, the more it made sense. There was the egalitarianism, the liberal theology, the progressiveness, doing away with the language of chosenness, and saying, this is just our path. This is not a superior path. So I was in grad school in Philly for 3 years. And to kind of earn some money and then be in practice of what I was learning about, I was teaching. And so when I went to look for where I would be employed, I thought, well, I could work in a Reform or a Reconstructionist shul and be out. And so I took my kind of shy, awkward self to a Reconstructionist community. And it was a really nice culture shock for me as a suburbanite who was raised in a small C conservative town. Because first off, I was thrown by everybody talking about their partners, which I had only ever heard as a way to be kind of intentionally vague about the gender of the person you were with. So eventually I was like, oh, they mean this is like an egalitarian parody of relationship thing. So this was the early 2000s, and it was my first time seeing families that looked like my family that I have now, with 2 moms and a couple kids, and that being really like normalized as not less than. So I was teaching and I was learning in grad school, and I had Reconstructionist teachers, and everything about Reconstructionism was continuing to make sense to me and felt really intellectually honest. And it was just this really nice little hippie enclave, and I was learning with really great, inspiring people, and my experience in that culture. And this was the first time I felt this, and I think this has continued to be a hallmark of Reconstructionism, was not just that nobody cared if my partner was a woman, because I theoretically had that in Reform settings, but that I didn't get the sense that I would be more accepted and welcome if Emily converted. Like, it's okay that you're gay, but you've got second-class status if your partner's not Jewish. So I think that kind of non-judgmental, no secret conversion agenda and welcome of interfaith families is a really important part of Reconstructionist communities. I also think incidentally, it's more likely to result in someone eventually feeling that they want to become part of the community. And so that, in that position, actually, fairly recently, RRC was the first rabbinical seminary to not officially require that graduates marry Jews. And that's something that's really important to me. So anyway, so in Philly, Emily and I were really welcomed into the Reconstructionist community and introduced to the lentil potluck and then quinoa. And the unruly hordes of children, which was really different from what my wife Emily grew up with, because she was raised Catholic. And then I taught at Dorsey, where Rabbi Toba was. So we moved to Boston so I could continue my grad studies. And then after a year, I started teaching again. And that's where I started at Dorsey and then at HBT. And then I found that the longer I spent in Reconstructionist communities, in a culture where the community was really primary, and there's a lot of intellectual integrity and commitment to social justice. And I didn't really experience either of those in ways that worked for me in other settings. And the changes from mainstream Judaism just really made sense. And so that's why I think there's this truism that most American Jews are actually Reconstructionist and they just don't know it. So the longer that I was in Reconstructionist communities, the stronger my identification became with Reconstructionism. And now I've been doing this for over 20 years, so it's pretty entrenched and comfortable.
Thank you all so much for sharing such deep parts of your personal journeys and connections to Reconstructionism. I'd like for us to also hear about how Reconstructionism plays a part in your role in the congregation. So as a congregant and lay leader, as a rabbi of a reconstructing congregation, and as an education director in a reconstructing congregation.
Yeah, I think one thing that also drew me to rabbinical school in this movement was sort of really a model of the rabbi as more like community organizer. In the conservative movement, the rabbi is called Mara Da'atra, which means the master of the place, literally, which means they have ultimate authority over decisions like Jewish ritual decisions and those kinds of things. And then while the Reform movement doesn't have that formally, because it's not a halachic movement, I think often that's the way the rabbi functions. And in our movement, I think there was an understanding that we were partnering with our congregations, we were leading certainly, and had authority, but also we're really there as community organizers, meaning how do I help this community move towards its vision? I like to say that I have a veto but not a vote. Meaning, ultimately it's the lay leadership that decides. If something was, gonna deeply, upset me, then I would leave. So that would be my veto. But ultimately it's not my decision. And I think so. To give an example of the process that I led was that I was very interested in Jewish approaches to economic justice. When I arrived at Dorsey Tzedek, when I arrived, it was 50-some households. It had the dues were incredibly low because it had no costs. It was like paying a little bit of rent in West Newton, and at the time, members were teaching the Hebrew school, and it had a student rabbi. So I think dues were like $200 or $300, dollars. So they raised enough money to bring a part-time rabbi for 2 years. But it was really clear we had to get our dues like in line to support a rabbi and then ultimately an education director and a school. So I led a process for 1.5 years that we called the Torah of Money. And it was to do sort of what Kaplan suggested. How have Jewish communities supported themselves, over the last 2,000 years? What are the values that we want to inform our decision making? And this is the values-based decision making that Craig mentioned. So out of that process came our financial system, which, and based on some biblical texts and other texts, but that there's a half shekel. Everyone pays $125. Every adult member, with that, you're a member, and above that, it's based on values. I mean, it's sort of a sliding scale based on values of justice. That some people have a lot more money than others in our capitalist society, so there's a sliding scale with suggested amounts, and then above that, for folks who want to add, there's a nadiv lev, a voluntary contribution. So that was and it was a community organizing process because it was not just the leadership deciding; it was classes that I taught. It was member meetings when we delved into this. It was house meetings where we decided we had to get 40%, at least 40% of the membership to show up to give their input. And then it was ultimately a vote. So that to me, as you know, as a rabbi, I'm very proud of that process. We've done other processes like that. That was probably the one that people had the most invested in because it's literally their pocketbooks. So that's been really powerful to me. And so for me as a rabbi, I feel like I'm trying to build covenantal community in which members are obligated to Judaism, but also to each other, and standing by each other. And I think we've really felt it in this really difficult moment. Like, we have a pretty diverse community in terms of Israel and Palestine, and no one's left, you know. We've managed to hold on to everybody. And I think that's a testimony to creating a community where people feel committed to one another, you know, and committed to our values, even when we differ painfully, you know, in a moment like this. So I think that's, I'll share that. Maybe congregant and then educator? Sure.
Yeah, so thinking about how being a Reconstructionist community affects sort of, you know, operations, as, you know, when I was synagogue president or in my years on the board. So one aspect, I think, is communal decision making. And I think we've all very recently experienced both the pros and the cons of communal decision making, is that everybody wants to provide input and cares and is engaged. That's the positive side. But it takes a whole lot longer to get everyone where the leadership might want to get to. The second aspect, and certainly Rabbi Toba's example indicated this, is it's a partnership between the board and the rabbi. And again, people who've only been at HBT might kind of take that for granted, but that's really unusual, this kind of partnership in process. Whatever, that financial example was a great one. And I can think of numerous examples we've experienced. One that comes to mind that's not as perhaps emotional is the kashrut policy. Like, when we're coming up with what it means for HBT to be a kosher setting, how do we balance what's in Jewish law against what enables our community to be a community?
And the decision to affiliate. I just said, or even the decision to affiliate was kind of a reconstructing process for HBT to affiliate reconstructing.
It very much was so. In fact, we joined during that process. HBT was not quite yet Reconstructionist when we joined. So that was great for us, a great way to meet people of the community and go through that process together. I'll say one of the things, I've done it less so in recent years, but certainly when I was president, like over the summer when we're much more lay led, I did some Divrei Torah, you know, the talks at the end of the Torah service. And in the summer, particularly, you're dealing with all that Leviticus kind of stuff, like all the rules about stoning and whatever. And so I always tried to approach that Torah study from a Reconstructionist perspective. Like, how do we, thousands of years later, engage with this text that seems primitive, barbaric, and even alien in some ways? How can we make it resonate for our lives today? We've heard a bit about sort of the Reconstructionist structures, you know, the Rabbinical College, the movement. Every few years, there's a convention for the whole movement. I've been to the last two. In fact, was even on the programming committee for those two. So that's another way, you know, as a lay leader that I've engaged with the movement. And I think another thing that is generally for me a very positive thing, it's not official, but it's essential, is the progressive politics of the movement. I think, you know, in recent months, it's felt like more of a struggle, given my relationship to Israel. But on the whole, the fact that we are, for the most part, a progressive movement is something that's really meaningful, important, and valuable to me.
Thanks. So I think in terms of, how Reconstructionism integrates into the curriculum, it's not something that I can isolate and be like, well, it's in this unit. I could look at certain approaches and say, well, Reconstructionism informs how we talk about God as a when rather than a what, in kind of non-humanistic, non-gendered language, how we teach about about mitzvot as Jewish obligations that are not dependent on the idea of Torah being literally given at Sinai to Moses by a commanding God. I think it informs a dual narrative approach to Israel and the concept of taking Jewish tradition seriously in order to make informed decisions as a community about what might need changing, which requires a high level of knowledge. So there's a lot along that vein. I was thinking that we have a really individualistic, kind of rights-centered society. And so the idea of choosing to accept and opt into a community where you cede some of your personal latitude to do what you feel like doing when you feel like doing it, to the primacy of community life and norms, and where your obligation is to the others in the community is really countercultural and really powerful. And even though sometimes it's a pain, it helps provide a really grounding and healthy sense of connection. I think not necessarily in the spiritual sense of connection to transcendence, although I think that's also scaffolded, but connection to something beyond the self and the individual family unit that can often be missing from people's lives. So I'm also going to bring it back to values-based decision-making in terms of enacting Jewish communal life rather than theorizing about it. So during the pandemic, when we were struggling with whether to return in person outside in the tail end of, I think it was 2021. So we were remote on Zoom for most of that year, and the teachers and the kids did a really good job of pivoting. And we had mostly ditched our usual curriculum. And there was this Jewish values-based, trauma-informed skills building program that we did. And then we had a combination of shorter all Zoom classes and one-on-ones for check-ins and Hebrew. And we were, trucking along. And then in the spring, there was a return to in-person learning. And we were wondering if we should try Chavrim in person, to be outside and socially distanced and masked, but at least physically together. And some people really, really wanted to do that. And some people really, really didn't. So for some kids and some families, it was a total no-brainer that in-person learning was way better than Zoom. You had positive social emotional experience, and that the risk when we were outside and masked and distanced was just minimal. And our safety would be way higher than what BPS or any of the other schools was providing. So that was just obviously the preference. And then on the other hand, there were people for whom it was a total no-brainer that Zoom was clearly the safest option, and it had been working well enough. And actually for some kids was even better than in person. They preferred it. So why would you push it and go in person with a bunch of kids who were already exposed to different populations in their schools, because we live in Boston, and you might spread COVID. So just so you could have, some side conversations and some off-topic chats. So for me, there were a lot of different factors. There were, I could see the benefits of in-person learning, and then the kind of the time, the energy of challenge of organizing outdoor class and balancing what teachers and families were comfortable with. And I was worried that some families wouldn't show up if we went in person. And I also knew that some kids were really struggling with virtual learning and were not participating and trying to meet everyone's needs when you really couldn't. So it was one of those situations where there was no clear right answer. And that's where the values-based decision-making came in and really helped me figure out a process where kind of talked to parents and school committee and Benita and Rabbi Barbara, and we identified what were the relevant values. And then, said, okay, we've got these values. We've got pikuach nefesh, preserving life, mutual responsibility, kol Yisrael aravim zeh bazeh, shlom bayit, communal harmony, and shivyon equity. So these were all at play. And you could also really articulate and identify like, wow, like these values are in tension with each other and point to conflicting situations. And I think that being able to have that laid out really helped people see and hold the complexity of the situation. So because Reconstructionism values consensus building and democratic decision making, so we had part of this process where we met and reviewed the factors and the tensions, and intentionally had a safe space for people to share their perspectives in connection with the values as we talked about what we should do. And that was, I think, really powerful because parents were able to directly hear that actually no, virtual learning didn't work for everyone. And it made it harder or impossible for some kids with disabilities to access the curriculum. And some people were coming from a place of having family members who were immunocompromised, and they weren't doing anything in person just to protect those family members. So at the end, the group came to a consensus that because we had already spent most of the year on Zoom, which was inaccessible for the kids who needed to be in person, we would hold the last few sessions in person outside, socially distanced, and that's what we did. But that for me was a really, really powerful and really positive process that I was proud of being able to kind of guide our community through. And I think one of the most amazing things was I felt like there were no hard feelings. And I think that if I had just either made the call myself or just met with school committee and leadership and said like, okay, this is what we're going to do. This makes the most sense. I feel like we would have had some hard feelings. But instead we had this community, this opportunity for people to hold complexity and competing values, which I think those are really important life skills. They are relevant now. They are relevant at many other times in life. I also think it's really great modeling for the kids, that we're holding that complexity and also having the opportunity to see people as human beings instead of just here, I want, this is what I want. I want my way. And that, if we were able to come to a place where everyone felt heard. And even I think the people who would have personally preferred staying on Zoom bought into the decision we had reached. And so that I think is a really powerful example of Reconstructionism in practice.
Kaplan called God the process. You got to love the process. I know we're, see, we've got like 10 minutes. Do we have time for questions or?
Yes, sorry. So we have about 10 minutes left. So I'd love to invite some questions from the audience. I think probably the most efficient way is to hear a few questions at a time and then let you guys answer whichever of them you'd like to. So yeah, I'll repeat questions. To what extent is Reconstructionism compatible with atheism? And if it is, how?
The other one is here. How do you think about the fact that, taken to its full extent, there's just a lot of relativism in Reconstructionism. Just kind of keep going. But it's a world in which there's very little left, or like you get to choose everything. So how to not be guilty, I guess, about just the fact that it could. But like it could just be whatever we want it to be. I don't know what to tell.
So the question is about relativism in reconstructing Judaism and the possibility of being able to really choose anything and or everything, and then what's left, and how do we reconcile? If I'm getting it right, how do we reconcile like what is actually Jewish or what is actually Reconstructionism with what isn't, if we could do it all? Great. Yeah.
And there are many big, important
things for our think about and respond to kind of at the same time. And many people, or the lay leaders, are working beyond capacity already, more so than usual. We always are more so. From a Reconstructionist perspective, how do we decision make around what how to tend to all of these very important and tasks that are presenting themselves at the same moment?
Great. So to repeat the question, HPT is currently between settled rabbis and lay leaders, and the board are at or beyond capacity. There are a lot of competing values and decisions that are all happening at once, and we are experiencing lots of challenges simultaneously. And so from a reconstructing perspective, how can we attend to things when it's all too much? So
Do you want to take the first?
Yeah, so the first thing, so your thing was about the relativism, and what was the first part?
Atheism.
Oh, atheism. So I'm going to plug my book. God is Here, Reimagining the Divine. It's for you. So I'm selling these on a sliding scale, $5 to $20. If you want one, come get one. You know, that'll answer your question. And February 13th at 8 p.m. on Zoom, I'll be doing a book talk with Josh Fagelson of the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. So I'm happy to stay over and give you a more serious answer. But I think I think there are ways to do that. I just want to read a line from Kaplan here. So when Kaplan writes, "The Jew must rediscover, reinterpret, and reconstruct the civilization of their people. To do that, they must be willing to live up to a program that spells nothing less than a maximum of Jewishness." We are a maximalist Jewish movement, not a minimalist Jewish movement. It's not about I do whatever I want. It's about how do I stay true to what I think Judaism is about, and how does that look today? And I think our progressivism is not just like, you know, we only hold these ideals, but it's rather where are Jews right now? That huge change in policy, which was quite radical, and we lost members when the movement when the college decided to change the policy that you had to be you could not be partnered with a non-Jew and graduate, was because of who was coming to rabbinical school and who wasn't able to come to rabbinical school, and saying we are losing Jewish leaders because their partners for whatever reason can't convert or can't or don't want to right now, you know, or might never, whatever. Every person is different. So that was and I saw my colleagues on the faculty there shift their position because of their contact with students. So I think the progressivism isn't getting rid of anything. It's just saying, where is the Jewish community right now? What's important? You know, we've taken on racial justice as a core element because the American Jewish community, I don't know if it's changed, but we've become more aware that there are Jews of color in our community, and we need to be doing a lot better job of becoming, you know, an anti-racist community. So to me, the progressivism is often a response to what's going on, but should never be. It's not a minimalist program. It's a maximalist program. While understanding, as Kaplan understood, that there's no Jewish community to put you in cherem to kick you out if you don't keep kosher, right? So you know, I feel as an educator, and I imagine Hillary feels like, how do we reconstructionist Judaism reconstruct it in such a way, as Kaplan said, that folks want to do this, right? Not that they could choose anything, but what makes me want to have an eating practice? What makes me want to have a Shabbat practice? What makes me want to engage with the divine, even though I'm really, really doubtful that God exists, you know? So that to me is the challenge in this moment, and in a culture in which there is a smorgasbord of things one can choose from. In terms of the overwhelmed leaders, I don't know. That's a hard one. I think it's just take care of yourselves. That's what I would say. And processes are long, and it's okay. Like you know, we move at the pace of trust. We don't move at some externally. I mean, you need to hire a rabbi. I understand that part, but in terms of wrestling with Israel, that problem ain't going anywhere. You know, folks, it's been with us for decades. We move as fast as we can, but we understand it takes time. So I know we just have a couple minutes, but more questions, or if you guys want to answer.
I mean, I have a one-word answer to the atheism question, which is yes. But in terms of the, you know, like, how do we trust? I mean, I think for one thing, in terms of it's the community rather than me personally deciding to do whatever I want. So I think that's part of what keeps it from becoming nothing. And the other is that it's a process, and it's a process where it is leaning, like Rabbi Toba said, towards maximalism, and towards really engaging with, right? Like if you can't, you have to know what you're dealing with before you're going to decide if it needs to be reconstructed, or transvalued. So I think it's hard because I've also wrestled with this. If there's no center, like where could it be? But that you just have to kind of trust the process, and that this is the Jewish people, kind of wrestling with the moment and how to enact Judaism. And I mean, so far we've done pretty well.
So I'll add one thing on that question about how do we deal with multiple challenges, right? An organization can't necessarily decide what its agenda is going to be. Sometimes the agenda is thrust upon it. And actually, the thing I'll say is I brought something from HBT to my work life. Usually it's the other way around, right? But in this case, I don't remember what year it was, but some number of years ago, there was a board orientation or a retreat, and there was a whole series of ground rules. And they were, what you'd expect: listen, be respectful. And at the bottom was one that said, step up and step back. And I said, well, what does that mean? And not only did I learn what it meant that day, but I've tried to embrace that, like I said, not just in my HBT interactions, but in my work life as well. And what that means is when the community, the organization, whatever needs you, step up and take a leadership role. And step back to give the others the space to be leaders, and trust that others will perform their role, their responsibilities well. So I think in a year where we have these unbelievable multiple challenges at the same time, that everyone should think about, when should I step up and when is it appropriate for me to step back?
Great, thank you. Should we take, I think there's a couple more, can we go for a few more minutes? Okay. All right, a few more questions. So the question is about how can we interweave awareness about Reconstructionism in our lives moving forward, because we don't have posters that just tell us what is Reconstructionism on our walls. At HBT. And a poster is a good idea. Matthew.
Is not centered in the discussions of
So the question is about Kaplan's use of describing Judaism with otherness, Jewishness as otherness, which in your experience is unusual because Judaism as civilization, Judaism as communal process. What is this Judaism as otherness? One last question, and then, yeah.
Only because, a lot of the cultural experiences I have in Judaism is like, you go there, you're always measuring everybody else and all that kind of stuff. Do you think that is a lucky coincidence in
So the question is, here at HBT, it feels like Judaism without judgment. Is that coincidence because HBT is just that lovely? Or is this actually a byproduct of the Reconstructionist way of being and processes?
Yeah, so on the otherness, I haven't gone deep in Kaplan on this. I think what he's talking about in Judaism as a civilization is, you know, he talked about Jews living in two civilizations and how. So there's the American civilization. So what makes Judaism distinct as a civilization? And you know, he also was an early Zionist and felt like reestablishing not necessarily a state, but a Jewish homeland with, you know, in a Hebrew-speaking Jewish homeland, and then Palestine was part of that to sort of feed the rest of. But he also imagined Jews having a seat at the United Nations as Jews, not as the state of Israel. Like he saw, you know, that the otherness was sort of our integrity as a people, as a civilization. I think that's what he meant by otherness. I do think the non-judgmentalists. I think folks at Dorsey would say that. You know, also at least in terms of Judaism, people might be judgmental about other things, but there's really no non-judgmental space anywhere. But because I think the sense of meeting Jews where they are, and instead of, and again, I think Kaplan, it was, and I think this relates to what you were saying, Claudia, because I think it's not Reconstructionist Judaism is not a dogma that like, here are the 5 points, you know, it's not like, you know, here are the 5 points you have to, it's an approach. So I think if you've gone through the process that Hillary just described at the religious school, or you go through a participatory process for choosing a rabbi that you're going through now, or you have a really deliberative, thoughtful process about how we were going to relate to Israel, Palestine. The people are experiencing Reconstructionist Judaism, you know, so you can have it on the, you know, or you play with God language, you know, or you don't have this notion. I mean, I think that, you know, the thing that I rail against the most is this notion that Orthodox Judaism is Judaism and everything else is less than. That's when people say, are we more or less than? I'm like, more or less than what? You know, like, I could say maybe those communities are completely failing in living up to other values of Judaism, even if they're, you know, keeping Shabbat to a T, you know, in a way that I don't, you know. So I think we shouldn't hold up any flavor of Judaism as Judaism. They are all reactions to modernism. Ultra-Orthodox Judaism is not traditional Judaism. It is a modern reaction to the emancipation. You know, Jews weren't ultra-Orthodox in the old days. They just were Jews and they did Jewish things. And, you know, one of my favorite stories is Rabbi Arthur Wasco tells about, grew up in an Orthodox household in Baltimore. And at a Passover time, his mother would go out with her best friend and they would just switch their regular plates because they couldn't afford to buy Passover plates, but they never told their husbands. That's what they were doing. So the husband just thought, oh, there are these really nice Passover plates that show up every Passover and then disappear. These were Orthodox Jews, but they were doing what they needed to do to, like, you know, make it work, and that's orthodoxy. So, you know, I do think, again, the sort of sense that there isn't a way to be Jewish. There's how do we want to be Jewish. We have standards, you know, whether those are ritual standards that we figure out for our kashrut policy, or ethical standards for how we, you know, engage with different, you know, types of people. And those are standards, and I think there is judgment around those, right? If we treat people in a way that we think is not right, we probably do judge them. But we're coming to that communally, and we're not saying that there is a way to be Jewish. I think that to me is, you know, that would be the Reconstructionist, you know, sort of orientation.
Great. Thank you so much for your answers, your perspectives, your all the different ways that you bring Reconstructionism into your personal and professional lives, or volunteering lives. And thank you for your thoughtful questions. I know I learned a bunch today, and I hope that we all come away from this with a deeper understanding of the Reconstructionist values that we hold so dear, and the ways that we can take those values into our lives outside these walls. And thank you so much to Lori and Shelley for helping to put this together. And enjoy the rest of your weekend, everyone.